There he is. Look at that. Shit, you look tired. What's wrong?
Tired. Okay.
Yes.
Good morning.
Thank you too, Paul.
Exactly. Yes. And like I said to you, we tend to go off topic because we like the sort of open, friendly, fireside chat approach. So wherever the discussion takes us is where we'll go. But we've got the sort of guideline questions that we put in place in case we should happen to accidentally run out of things to talk about, which never happens, to be honest with you. By the way, I did start recording right from the start. Anything that we've recorded is free for us to use because we do little funny snips at the beginning before the episode starts. So anything you've said will and can be held against it.
Okay, noted.
Ville, are you ready to go?
Yep, good to go.
Yes. Adam, you ready to go?
Rock and roll.
Fantastic. Let's kick off this episode then.
Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Paul Krogdahl and Ville Sointu. This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello guys, and welcome back to another fantastic and interesting, we hope, season of Fintech Daydreaming. It is episode 1 of season 7. I cannot believe that we have already reached season 7. Something that started off for Ville and I as just a small little idea, a project, a hobby, something we just threw around one evening of, hey, why don't we start doing a podcast? And look where we are now. We've got close to 2,000 followers on LinkedIn. We're on YouTube. We are on most of the podcasting channels. We are starting to get, I won't say starting, we have for almost from the start had fantastic guests with us, and today is no different. It is the start of 2023. And we are looking forward to covering some of the interesting things that are looking to be on the wall for this year. ESG, continuation of embedded finance, the continued disruption of payments. I mean, even blockchain is starting to take some interesting returns into the discussion. So let's see where we're going to go in all of this. But we're kicking off today with ESG. But before I go anywhere, as always, I am Paul Krogdahl. That will never change. I will always be Paul Krogdahl unless something strange happens along the way. But for the time being, I'm still Paul Krogdahl. And I've got with me my one and only fantastically true partner in FinTech and FinTech Daydreaming, Ville. How are you?
I'm doing good, despite you telling me as soon as you saw me on camera, you told me that, you look really tired, which I guess it's a euphemism for saying that you look like crap. But anyway, I'll take it.
Those are your words, not mine.
Yeah. So I'll take it. I'll just blame the fluorescent lighting here in the meeting room where I'm in right now, because of course I'm traveling again, so not in my home studio at the moment. But again, starting season 7, looking really good. I would just like to add to the list that you mentioned on the topics of 2023 and again our season 7. It will be the year of artificial intelligence. I think the emergence of generative AI applications like ChatGPT towards the end of last year really showed us the way this technology can actually change a lot of things in the world. Remains to be seen how this will impact the financial services space, of course, but I think we're going to be having a lot of those conversations, and I'm looking forward to bringing on some guests to talk about that as well. But today it's going to be something else. So why don't you bring our guest into the conversation?
Absolutely, and I'd be delighted to. We are joined today by Adam Thompson, who is, I would say, one of my most favorite go-to people when it comes to ESG. And before we even get into the whole depth of ESG and what ESG is, what it means to the industry and to us as individuals, maybe, Adam, a quick introduction of who you are, how you got here, and what's your superpower?
Sure. And firstly and foremost, thank you both for having me on today's podcast. So I'm Thompson. I'm a EU Climate Pact Ambassador, and I'm also a Global Sustainable Finance and ESG offering leader in the informatics space. I've been working in ESG for the last half a decade, and in the industry in banking and financial markets specifically for the last 15. I would say I've gone through the whole life cycle from researcher to developer to your system admin, your business analyst, all the way through now to hopefully providing provoking thought leadership. I suppose my superpower, as ironic as this sounds, is actually common sense. Because when we actually start talking about ESG and all the technology enablement and all the data creation, all the good stuff that you can get and in terms of line of sight, there's actually quite a lot of it where you need to keep your feet back down to earth and actually just really look, from the wood between the trees. And we'll talk a lot about trees today, no doubt. But I think that is actually common sense is not so common. So I fall into quite a rare category in that regard. But that said, I love applying this to financial markets. And more importantly, I love that we can actually make an impact. And that's hopefully what we're going to talk about today, a little bit more from the ESG lens.
I think that's fantastic. One of the interesting things here is ESG has become a hot topic buzzword, really to a lot of people only sort of recently as last year. And here you're saying that you've been involved in this space for quite some time. Maybe we should start with, what is ESG? What does it stand for? Why is it important? Why is it so important now? And why do the banks and us as individuals have to care?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I'm getting goosebumps because I'm going to tell the story as to what was my sort of aha moment as to why I wanted to get into ESG. So I've worked pretty much around the globe, 40 plus different countries. I'm a bit of a nomad. I live in the Bavarian forest by choice. But I was actually working in a particular central bank in the European area. And it was like all of us who will be listening in, none of us work 9 to 5, but every evening I kept coming out this bank, out of their facilities. And in the evenings, the fire exits were actually with homeless people in the fire exits. Now, if you can imagine that in terms of monetary policy and what's actually the reality of social, for me, it was just a no-brainer to say, look, there's something fundamentally wrong here. We have to change what is happening. The other sort of semi-aha moment, which sort of gave me a bit of a kick up the posterior to really, move thoughts into actual actions. Where I live is a place called Passau, which is bordering between Austria and Germany. And it's pretty much the gateway for, during the recent influx of human migration. So when we've had recent geopolitical tensions and as a result coming in, it was very interesting for me also to see just the local reaction in this regards, but also the support that was in place to make actually solutions, but not just in the front line, but also more to the people that are being impacted directly. And so for me, it was a bit of a question to say, well, how am I going to get involved, or how can I get started? And then the other thing which really resonates with me personally is the concept of greenwashing, because you hear a lot about ESG, you hear the acronyms obviously about E being environmental, S being social, G being governance or economics. But in this regard, it's more about what's actually the single source of truth, and how do you actually provide that line of sight so you know what you're doing is beneficial at the end of the day, and it's not just something that's for marketing or communication purposes, but actually has a material impact. And I think that's, I'm already getting on my soapbox, I know, but that for me is the basics of humanity. And you'll hear this other expression, quadruple bottom line. And I think this is really true. When we talk about people, planet, prosperity, and purpose, or if you like, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, the 17 of them, they resonate so powerfully, because if you actually take a step back from technology, but just what's happening to us right now on this planet, 140 million people can be displaced by 2030 because the planet's warming up. I mean, that's just wrong, fundamentally. And then you look at it also in terms of some of the so-called projects that are meant to be providing positive impacts. And you realize that it's not taking into consideration about native species if we're looking at nature or flora and fauna and all the rest. And you might be thinking, hey, a minute, this is a banking podcast. Yes, because actually when you look at those ecosystem services, not just economically, but also technology-wise and what it gives you for value, that is not just a differentiator, that's moving everybody into a positive future. So positive nature capital flows it's not just a buzzword or like a trend. It's a must. It's the next commodities. Those commodities is what we should be investing in and focusing on right now. And yes, there's lots of great stuff that is going on. I'm not going to discard that. You should never, throw the baby out with the bathwater. But that said, there's definitely a need to step back and reflect and look at what is the other wealth of technology and data that's out there, which you can be leveraged and actually you can contribute towards yourself. And maybe I'll pause there to get the next question in, but we have a couple of cracking examples which are going to be announced in the next 4 to 6 weeks as well, specifically around nature.
Look, fantastic amount of passion there, right? It's always fantastic to have guests that come on here that live for and have a passion for what it is they're talking about. And I have a feeling this is going to be a podcast we would want to go on for 3 hours rather than just the normal 45 minutes. But it's actually interesting, everything that you've laid out there, because to very many people, and I've got to admit for me very early on as well, when we're talking about ESG, the only thing I was thinking about was the environmental part, right? To me, it was just about, it's the greenness and the forests and the trees and everything else. But as you sort of described it there, it is actually an awful lot more and a much wider context to ESG and what we should be thinking about. And I hear a lot of those undertones there that we've talked about quite a lot in banking for quite so many years, the unbanked, the underbanked, the social impact, et cetera, and they're all filling in there. So it makes an awful lot of sense to me. But I'm then wondering in that, when we look at this from the role of the financial institutions in promoting ESG goals and delivering against them, how can the fintechs and the banks leverage their unique strengths to drive a positive change in this area at all?
Yeah, I think let me start on the macro level to answer that. So I think first and foremost, looking at the distribution of the 8 billion plus people that we have on the planet, but also the capital and where that is right now, you have to, yes, it's climate first, but it's not climate only. And the E, the S, and the G, they're all intrinsically linked. So it's all well and good to look at pathways to net zero, carbon neutrality, or negative carbon pathways, etc. But you also have to realize that when you're providing your data as E as environmental, climate's just a subset. You also got your biodiversity, you also got your water effluency, circularity, waste, etc. The other thing that we have a bit of a challenge right now, yes, there are data curation challenges, but I wouldn't say that's the blocker. I think that's, to be honest, people not trying hard enough because the solution's already out there. It's more about that engagement model and change management to look at, if I'm missing certain data in certain sectors, how can I leverage AI, geospatial, or other techniques to be able to, if you like, fill out that picture? But on the other side, it's also about how do you then bring it back from, yes, the investment lens, also partly the regulatory lens, but the communication, that's the challenge. So as you say, E being environmental, if there was a research done by University of Zurich around Easter time last year, where they looked at ESG risk rating providers and all the top logos. So if anyone's listening, I'm not going to create any liability here, but on the same notion, if you take the paper, and it was written by, it's called the Divergent of ESG Ratings. Taking the top 5, it ranges from having and using SASB, so Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, as the framework to do the comparison. It ranges from the lowest being 38 indicators to 282, but even the best in class at 282 aren't taking into consideration all the environmental aspects. And I think if you're as a bank or a fintech, it's almost looking at, well, look, climate first, but now if I move into nature and I look at biodiversity, and I need to, let's take one of the new regulations, Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure. And I won't go complete acronym soup today, just to caveat before I get going. But the first step of the methodology, which is formerly known as LEAP, is locate. So you need to have your geospatial data for your operations, also where you're actually based, so your longitude, latitude, but also your value streams as to where you're performing. And that traceability is a new data stream for most banks today. They simply haven't had to curate it in the past, so there was no need. But actually, if you start looking at that and applying that to the broader ESG elements, take social, for example, communities where they have their business, maybe they're creating widgets and they're having certain emissions going into the atmosphere. What's the impact to the local community? It's that data stream that you now need, not just for decarbonization, but also employee health and safety, looking at the ecosystem values for how do you do restoration activities. And those restoration activities, by the way, nature, I keep harping about this, nature is implicit, but it's like 44%, I'm going to quote the team now, it's like $44 trillion of economic value is through nature. So it's not like this is a buzzword and I'm a tree hugger. Yes, I do love trees, and that's different science with Japan. We'll come on to another podcast a different day. But the point here, it has monetary value as well as the benefit to the broader society. And I suppose more importantly, putting the value where it's needed. So I'll give one last one and I'll pause. I'm going to give a shout out to our friends at Rebalance Earth, where I'm going to ask you, pal, how much do you think a dead elephant is worth today? You know, for the ivory, just on the black market. What would you think?
Oh gosh, no idea.
No idea.
Just for the ivory, let's say as that's an industry that means nothing to me. 15,000. 15,000. I've got no ivory, never bought any, never thought about buying it, and I don't hang around elephants. But let's say 15,000.
Well, thank you for the disclaimer. So you can triple that figure to get around to what the market value is today. But that said, an elephant that's alive, and Rav Kemi, and I love the guy dearly. I mean, he's come up with the mathematics to work out an elephant alive today is worth around $1.6 to $2 million. I mean, just to show you the comparison and why. So if we look in carbon markets, carbon per ton is around $25, depending what you're obviously going to purchase. A live elephant is $100 a day, $100, 4 times that. And now if you look at that in terms of also the elephant being the farmer of the forest, just like a whale is the farmer of the oceans. And again, this is a banking podcast, everybody. You're not tuned into the wrong one. But actually, when you're actually starting to look at it in terms of, well, how can you link that as an asset so it's tokenized, and that asset can actually be purchased and is on the balance sheet of that respective organization, and it's only going to keep appreciating because, you know what, by preserving the elephant, one park ranger can actually provide the same GDP output as 200 people in the local community where they might live in Central Africa, for example. It's huge. It's the multiplier factor. And this is exactly where the focus needs to go. It's this whole new line of sight as to that is the front line, which we should be looking at right now, because that's exactly where the biggest impacts are happening and where we can also make a material impact through diverting those capital flows in a positive manner.
So let me just sort of twist on that a little bit, because a lot of people are sort of have this perception that the banks are doing what they're doing, and we'll keep the fintechs out for the time being, because fintechs generally tend to just look for opportunities to engage, to drive, new opportunities. But for the banks, they're already in this business. Their business is money, and for all intents and purposes, trust, right? Some could take the argument that the banks are doing this purely just because they're being required to do so by regulation. Or is there actually a large potential for revenue, new revenue and profit for banks by actually following down this ESG road correctly, rather than just the greenwashing that we've seen a lot of banks doing?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think the first part is that, look, any enterprise on the planet, regardless which sector or industry you're in, if you're not going to be a sustainable organization or have a sustainable strategy, so creating value based on values, you're not going to be existing by the end of the decade anyway. I think that's a given, both from a corporate lens as well as from a consumer lens. Now, I think the next part is about the regulations, and given my global role, I've been very fortunate, especially this last year, and I will caveat the amount of travel I do. I only do it if it's impactful. So I have done a fair bit this last year. But it really is quite interesting. I've been talking to Centurion banks along Wall Street, where they're very passionate, telling me they're going to fight the SEC around a lot of the regulations that are being proposed. I have here in Europe, so looking very much in the coming weeks to meeting Frans Timmermans, who wrote the EU Green Deal in a couple of weeks' time, where they're really embracing and looking at new policies, and even trying to, where there are unregulated markets, like in the voluntary carbon markets, come up with frameworks to at least provide safeguards and rails. And then you've got like Japan. I was just prior to Christmas, so really going around the globe now for APAC, where they realize they're playing catch up a lot in this, not because of necessarily the broader ESG, but realizing the value creation that could be had is something that they had missed. And we've been speaking very openly to a number of institutions around that, both in private and public. And for me, what's positive is everybody at least has finally come to the point that bit of Greta here, listen to the scientists, but also realize that there is value to be achieved by leveraging ESG, but holistically, and not just to try to monetize this for a particular metric that looks good on your books for a particular subset of client base that you might have. Now, that said, you then got to realize what are the capabilities you're missing to be able to leverage that value and that insight. And the discussions that I've been having around the globe, staying in Europe then, of one particular bank here was about, well, how can they actually support that in the front end for their decision making, for when they're starting to look at green mortgages, green credit cards, green, not just to call it green, but actually embedding that as part of the decision intelligent workflows, and what are the data streams that are required to achieve that line of sight, but also provide justification at the end of the day, because this is a new space for a lot of organizations. But it's also an education for a lot. You've got a lot of organizations that might be in a more of a traditional organization for strategy and how they perform their business historically. But if you look at the regulation side, yeah, the ESG risk ratings, and in the UK market, you've got Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor, who's obviously tackling that with his Edinburgh memorandum. But equally on the other side, you've got the green asset ratio that's only 12 months down the road, where banks actually have to show how much of their portfolio is actually green by the EU definition. And I think that's also going to be a bit of a sea shift, because it's not just about window dressing your books. There you really have to map against it's known as NACE, the indices, against the EU taxonomy, so then you can really show that you're making that sustainable transition. And I think it's really going to come to a crossroad before even 2030 in this regards, as to how many assets are available out there. And I think this is actually quite an interesting point, both in the voluntary carbon markets. We have an inventory issue right now. I don't know if many know that, in terms of being able to do offsetting. But likewise, for the banks that we speak to who are, let's say, at the top end of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, so really torchbearers leading in this space, struggling to find green assets. And I think that's the other area where AI has a role to play. Because if I give, and again, I'm going back to my tree hugging, so I apologize, but coming back from my journeys last week in Portugal, where they're looking at the forest that they have, but then how can they actually leverage the forest with a change of forest management, which will increase the amount of carbon sequestration of a forest, include obviously the social element, but also allow it to be then assetized for the next 20, 30 years accordingly for whoever those financial institutions are. And I think for me, that's super exciting and interesting, but you need completely new data sets like water participation, what's the trend of the actual climate change, what's the tree species that can actually even survive there, how do you prevent bushfires? All of this sort of risk management area, which has been around for a little bit with TCFD, so Task Force of Climate Financial Disclosure, about physical risks, transition risks, and so on. But actually getting away from the disclosure and operationalizing that's the step change for 2023 that banks really need to think about. It's not just the rearview mirror. And the final one for Europe specifically is, if you look at ESRS, so European Sustainability Reporting Standards, that's my last acronym for today, I promise. It's no longer this rearview mirror look. You've got to look all the way to 2050. I mean, I remember being in the square mile in 2008, where it wasn't much fun, to be very honest, during the last banking financial crisis. And we had good old Mark Carney come on and say, hey, now we've got forward guidance. Fantastic. But forward guidance for him was like the next couple of quarters or a couple of years maximum. Now we're talking to 2050. That's how you do that in terms of which assumptions, what are the variables that you want to use in terms of denominators, etc. That's incredibly challenging for anyone. But then imagine you haven't got the data, never mind a crystal ball, to be able to use that for forecasting. I think AI, to come back to Ville's point at the beginning, it's got a huge role to play, but I think it's got to be, bringing my common sense lens, a little bit of a step back as to what are the actual capabilities in terms of data sets or markets that we want to actually contribute here to start that journey. And I think that's where banks are struggling a little bit at the moment.
So as you correctly pointed out, this is a fintech and banking podcast. So you mentioned a couple of keywords there, or trigger words for our listeners sometimes, things like tokenization and regulation.
Yeah.
Now, we get a lot of, talk around the topic that things like cryptocurrencies, because they are unregulated, they are better for the environment. They actually achieve the ESG goals better. They are spinning a lot of narrative around this. But instead of just going into the usual discussion about Bitcoin and stuff, let me just put it this way. Do you think regulation is necessary, or is it actually something that is slowing down the development of towards ESG goals in this financial services space specifically?
I think that's a great question. I don't have that one before. So I think it's a mix of the two. I think what you found is that just historically, you had Europe, which has been more the torchbearers, generally speaking, and then you've got a number of the other geos around the globe that are playing catch up. That said, of course, any investment is cross-border. It doesn't matter where we obviously physically sit. And as a result of that, there need to be some form of guardrails, because when we come to comparing the apples and apples, I think there are unfortunately too many loopholes still to date. So let me give you one example, like with the voluntary carbon markets, they're unregulated. But what you find is that one standard where you can say, I'm now certifying against standard A, where as long as I plant trees, the trees are in the risk assessment are going to do X amount of carbon sequestration over a time frame of 20, 30 years, whatever. It might not be a native tree species, right? And it might be an invasive tree species. So I know that's a really simple example, but then if you apply that to more granular and how complex this does go, I think there needs to be a minimum baseline. On the other side of the coin, I think the innovation, so coming back to Rebalance Earth or some of the work we're doing also with engineered reefs, is super, super exciting in that we're able to get absolute data sets which are above and beyond any standards for carbon sequestration below the sea line. And I mean, that is just, it is a first of a kind, but you wouldn't get that if you were in a regulated market. You would be, I don't want to suggest it's just a tick box exercise. It's not. But I think you need to have that provocation of the innovators to come actually think about what is prudent, and then afterwards maybe harmonize that. And I think we're seeing that with a number of the biodiversity regulations right now. So TNFD is still in consultation. Next release will be in February, and then September will be the final recommendation. You have GRI, which a lot in the for up until last year we're talking about SASB more on the investor lens, GRIs, so Global Reporting Initiative on the dual materiality lens. They've got something also for biodiversity come February, but also you need to look at it from a data standard lens. So ISO, for example, also have something that known as TCF 440 going through right now. So I think the challenging is it has been acronym soup, and there have been different actors running at different levels. But I think the one thing that has changed in the last 12 months, which has been a benefit to everybody, especially a shout out for TNFD, is that they created these knowledge partners. So instead of actually setting anything in stone as these are the goalposts, they've been working with all the above names plus more to work out what would be, let's say, a pragmatic approach. And then, of course, no doubt it'll iterate and there'll be updates in the foreseeable future. But at least it allows that baseline so that globally, everybody has the same foundation to start with. And for me, I think that's useful because it also allows the do's and the don'ts while giving room for innovation, which might not necessarily have been there when it's so prescribed like it has been back in the day. I remember when SOX and Basel kicked in, and I wouldn't want to go there again. So absolutely, it's a balancing act. Maybe a long-winded answer, but hopefully it gave both sides of the coin.
It did, pun intended, I suppose. And I also dropped a few more acronyms in there. So, but anyway, it's fine because it's a fintech podcast. We love our acronyms anyway. So.
We do indeed, yes. Actually, I was just thinking a little bit based upon what you were saying there. You keep referring back to the data sets, having the data, more and more data, collection of data, storage of data. We start getting into compute and the need for compute. One of the things that's also part of this discussion is around green IT. It's around, energy neutral or carbon neutral data centers, so on and so forth. I'm wondering, can fintechs and banks, as this is a technology aligned podcast, can the fintechs and banks use technology to improve their ESG performance? Or is there a double-edged sword here where as you use more technology to help you with the ESGs, you're actually increasing your carbon footprint, and therefore, you have to find that equal good balance? Or is it a round robin dying game almost?
I think you semi-answered it in the question. It really is slightly a bit of it depends. So for example, with the green IT element, there are numerous ways for optimization and with or without ESG to obviously reduce your carbon footprint that you have today. So we've done that with organizations. We've looked at a number of virtual machines, how you obviously harmonize that and without any performance degradation. And I mean, we're talking the magnitudes of like 7 to 8 metric tons per annum that can be saved. So this is not insignificant. It has really impacts both from the emissions, but then also the energy consumption. Obviously, we still are in an energy crisis, as well as obviously the inflation in terms of operational efficiencies. The other part there, which you were sort of semi-touching on, was more about the broader, let's say, what we formerly know as responsible computing elements. So there are the technological factors and there's the societal factors. So it's not just about obviously employee health and safety, the rest, that's very important. But when we start looking at good code, clean code, but also looking at it from the AI lens as to how the code is being leveraged. Yeah. Around May, June time, we inaugurated the Responsible Computing Forum, another non-for-profit, which actually takes into account these to allow for the transparency, but also guidelines as to which areas you want to, let's say, not always talk about just climate, but look at how that data set can be leveraged. Now, the final one, which is sort of semi-touched on, was about the volume of data, because if they're not creating data today, well, that's going to be let's say a new real estate that you're going to have to extend, augment, or whichever strategy you want to be able to leverage it. And if we're talking about certainly the geospatial data that we leverage, and we're talking like petabytes, so like 250 petabytes a day, that's not an insignificant amount. So you've got to come up with a good strategy as to how you want to digest, and obviously, from a materiality viewpoint, you look at which sectors are most impactful. But to be honest, if it's geospatial, by definition, you're taking normally a picture of the entire globe and then ingesting that and doing your analytics accordingly. So what you will find is that over time, some of the data sets, and there is obviously a catalog of data sets out there for different use cases, but some of the larger ones, certainly I think there are going to be more, let's say, harmonized, that there will be a global standard, which people would then just ingest as an entity rather than curating it for themselves. But then vice versa, there's something tactical where you have, let's take, I think Plastic Bank is a fantastic one, right? Both from technology, but also the societal and environmental elements. Then absolutely, there would be, let's say, those engagements, which would just be specific for that project, which would then have XYZ impact to your overall scorecard of metrics. And I think one thing that we haven't said, and I know you guys give money, it's bank and fintech, but I think what's important is what are the metrics throughout the organization, not just at the aggregated level, but really at the IT level. And I spoke with a agriculture clients also just prior to Christmas, where they were looking at how can you apply green IT software patterns to actually make the code more effective. And that's not to change all their software language, but really starting to change the culture and the mindset of their developers to take that into account as one of their design principles from the word go, and then using a transformation office, obviously capturing that in terms of the overall benefit, both from carbon footprint in this case, but obviously also there'll be a dollar sign associated with that. And I think that's another thing which always sometimes gets missed, is that engagement model part, as to making sure that's also put on it. Because again, back to the intro at the beginning of the podcast, there's a huge element of education and knowledge sharing that still is required, because this is such a broad topic, and there won't be one single person who will be Einstein, know all of this, right? It's going to need to be modularized specific to those job role skill sets.
So let me put a pin in that green IT, responsible computing point with a flippant, dumbass question. Everybody's saying that the way to get carbon neutrality is cloud computing. All the cloud providers are saying, we will help you with reducing your cost. We will help you with reducing your carbon footprint. The answer to everything is cloud. So if I'm a bank and I stick everything in the cloud, I've solved all my problems, right? We're all happy and I'm very green and good for me.
Yeah, I mean, not to cut off my right arm here, or reduce my network on LinkedIn and so on. The devil's in the detail is what I would say. And I think there's, not to go too architectural, but I think there's a play as to what do you need to stage versus what you need to ingest at the end of the day. And I think that the bottom line is it has to be a holistic approach. Don't just take slide and marketing way for what it says. I mean, really do the homework, because I've seen vice versa in that situation. And just be pragmatic, I think, is the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. So how can banks and fintechs, particularly banks, differentiate themselves then from the general population when it comes to focusing on ESG and truly demonstrating that they are following ESG, delivering on their, not just their requirements, but what we as society would like to see them do?
Yeah. I think the first thing before I speak to whether it's a client I've had for a period of time or a new logo for a discussion, is really looking at their own commitments and their own skin in the game as to, it's not charity starts at home, but it really is, if you want to be the torchbearer, you want to lead, then you lead by example. So when we look at their UN SDGs and looking at what is the areas that they want to impact, not to do all 17 US SDGs, but really looking at if it's climate action, so SDG 13, what are the decarbonization activities or thematic investing that they're doing in this space? And how and which other standards are they actually aligning to here so it's comparable? And then you get to the point of what's the timelines? Because let's just remind everybody, if we want a planet, and for my kids and for everybody else's children and next generations to have a planet to live on, we need peak emissions by 2025. So I can tell you, when I speak to certain C-suites and they're talking about the regulations rather than talking to me about impacts, I respect that. But on the same notion, I always remind about what are the macro events and circumstances that we have, because it's borderless, this challenge. And I mean, also, if we just take the US market, since 1980 till today, is $2.4 trillion of devastation due to climate change. And it's going to be about $2 trillion per annum from around 2050 onwards. So this is not an insignificant amount of money that we're talking about here, and certain industries just won't exist if we don't change, right? So when we're looking at, well, how do they lead then? If it's a strategy which is ESG, but I just see climate, so net neutrality, net pathway, and nothing else going on there, then of course by character, I like to share, but I'm also, I've been in Netherlands, I think, too long as well. I'm a bit Dutch and I'm a bit straight to the point. So look, intrinsically, you need to look at how are you going to address those other benefits, which can actually add value to your organization as well. So simple ones, from whether it's even board representation, whoever came up with 40-60 between the gender equality, I have no idea, but it should be 50-50. But I mean, strides going in the right direction, but now take it to the next level down. How about the rest of the organization setup and that diversification? And if there's nothing there in that regards, then yes, it's great to have a conversation and look at opportunities to expand. But I think the other part is that if you haven't got that rounded approach, coming back to, there is not going to be one Einstein that knows all, you're going to struggle with your broader ESG strategy anyway, because it's going to be very much your eggs all in one basket if it's climate in this case. And I think, please do not ignore that the trends are, nature's already here. 2023 is the year that we're going to be investing in nature in a real fundamental shift. But societal topics are literally just around the corner. So really do have that mindset that it's not that the horse is bolted, but the train's left the station. And if you're not on it, you better catch up, because otherwise you'll be overtaken by your industry incumbents. And just look at the recent Dow Jones Sustainability Index report just before Christmas as to the movers and the shakers. It's an interesting read as to which parts and geos of the world are really making the biggest inroads.
So let me put you a little bit on the spot before Ville jumps in with another question. Put you a little bit on the spot, and I understand if you don't want to answer this. We've asked in the past our guests to say, well, give us an example of the winners and the losers from your perspective. But I'm going to be kind to you and say, out of all the banks you've spoken to, which 2-3 banks have stood out as really impressing you as engaging on this and being seen as leaders?
Yeah, so for me, BBVA, absolutely. Their strategy and their investment also in the incubator status in terms of tech startups. I know multitude of banks have that, but I mean, actually really being very tactical and specific as to which biomes or realms around nature in particular that they're looking at investing. So coming back to the engineered reefs, that for me is fascinating. And just put in context, there's going to be around 7,000 to 8,000 new engineered reefs that need to be deployed by the end of this decade. And you think about that in terms of the asset, the value, but also the fact that trees, they're obviously the carbon sink, 7 billion per annum, but the fact that under the ocean, it's about a 10x in terms of carbon sequestration, then you start to get a feel as to, yes, the business case, but also how we stop coastal erosion, how we actually help the local fishing communities, bring back the diversity vegetation indices, but also obviously income at the end of the day. Let's be honest, they've been eroded because we've got the whole issue there. So that was number one. I think the next one for me, and this one is controversial because unfortunately some media has not been kind with those who used to be in the bank leading sustainability, but HSBC in terms of their labeling approach, I think that one is also quite unique in terms of they have obviously a large footprint in the APAC region and looking at how they're looking at sustainable infrastructure. I think that was unique in that they brought together a nice ecosystem partnering approach. So they realized that it's not just going to be one size fits all, but how do we actually leave nobody behind and bring them along? And that's going to be around $7 trillion worth of investment. So that's also hugely significant. I'm toying with. I like, there's another one in the square mile, but I probably would pause. But the only reason I'm pausing is because they haven't released the product yet. But there's one which is really consumer based, that's looking at how to educate really at grassroots level. So you or I with our credit cards, with our debits cards, etc., and how to actually not just report this, or using simple spend-based data methodologies to work out carbon footprints, but actually then looking at the next best actions and informing them that decision making. So that one we can do on a future one, or maybe we can send out on the comments when it's published. But in terms of those who are the worst, I'm not going to make many friends when I go back to New York, but I was really quite upset, to be honest, with a couple of the Centurion banks who literally take the mentality that ESG is a load of baloney and we're going to fight it through the courts and we're never going to have to report this stuff. It pains me, to be very honest. I mean, I'm 37, so I'm not new kid on the block. I'm not the old one. I'm sort of in the middle of the road, I suppose. About to have my midlife crisis at some point, no doubt. But I mean, joking aside, it's with having that benefit of seeing how the industry's evolved, but also knowing what's around the corner. I think any organization whose C-suite is talking to me like that, they should take a very long, hard look at themselves, because honestly, A, the consumer will leave, but B, then they're not going to be ready for when that transition comes. And that should not be, they should wait for the regulator to tell or dictate that. That should be very much so that they should be taking strides, especially with a heritage of 100 years plus. I mean, they should be really formally in the driving seat, given their connections.
Yeah. So now we kind of covered the good and the evil of this side, but let's get to the middle of the road. So we need to talk about the ugly, I guess. Yeah. And from a very practical standpoint, and I guess this is your superpower, common sense. So we're going to ask you to tap into that right now. So from a very practical standpoint, so if you look at banks today, what are they doing in ESG? If your average bank in the bank markets, I mean, they are typically sustainable investing options. There's different kinds of carbon offset options that you're able to maybe choose as a customer of the bank. And we talked about the lack of regulation in certain spaces when it comes to these types of instruments. But the bottom line there is that a lot of these things are very opaque in terms of how they are defined and how are their impact actually measured, and are these even good at the end of the day. There seems to be more and more media attention put to these topics these days, when people are starting to question whether even carbon credits and things like this are actually having the impact that people think that they have. So clearly, it's a problematic space. Now, Is it all smoke and mirrors, or I guess how do we fix this opaqueness in these markets?
Yeah, so I mean, you were touching on specifically there a little bit the voluntary carbon markets, which has been, let me just contextualize. So obviously carbon markets are nothing new. There's compliance and there's voluntary. We'll keep out compliance for today's discussion, given that's obviously mandated by jurisdictions with emissions trading. But if we're talking about voluntary in terms of net zero pathway and how banks can act as a decarbonization advisor and which offsets they might recommend to their clientele or even invest for their own purpose, it really has been smoke and mirrors, because what you found historically is that a majority of transactions have been really around the energy credits, and they're pretty much dried up. So those which are, let's say, your non-wind turbines or your solar and all the rest, we're now looking at nature-based solutions. Traditionally, it takes around 2 to 5 years to be able to have a credit in the voluntary market that can be then leveraged to be traded. But coming back to some of our earlier discussion, there are different levels of standards in terms of how rigorous they are in the criteria. The good news is the press has obviously got hold of that. The market is growing. Why is the market growing? Well, we've obviously had 4x in terms of net zero commitments in the last 18 months. There's about 8x still to go until probably 2025 of corporations. So the market's only going to keep getting hotter because you should first off look at avoided emissions. And I think that's something that is going to also get more attention. So we always speak about scope 1, 2, and 3, and then we get to scope 4, which nobody even has heard of, but it exists. So I think that metric's going to come out. But then I think if you come back to the market as to what's actually being traded right now, it was 2 years ago a billion market. Last year it was 2 billion. By the end of decade, if we take a midpoint, we're looking around 30 to 35, 40 billion. So this is not insignificant. You have to then change the market in terms of the regulation. So there are what's now known as jurisdictional and sovereign markets. Now, if we take jurisdictional, let's say the midpoint from voluntary being the Wild West, jurisdictional has, let's say, a bit more safeguards around it, and then you have the sovereign where that's what it says on the tin. You're looking at a limited number of players that are in a particular country or geography, such as the continent in the sense of European Union, and then they would then define what the framework and the rules of engagement are. What is the benefit of that is it's not just, okay, I have a carbon footprint and I still got to do some transformation, so I need to offset. It also means that you're obliged to then invest in the local communities where that offset is being produced. So actually during COP15, the country of Gabon, which is to the best of my knowledge, is the second most forest country on the planet. I think 87% or something of that ilk. They launched a framework. It's all public, by the way. Anybody interested, look into this one. A framework with the UNFCCC using RED Plus, known as the framework, where they got around 15 billion is what they're looking at in terms of revenue. But more importantly, everything will then get reinvested in terms of whether it's education, whether it's if it's health, etc. And I think that's the trend that we're going to see, because nobody wants to be associated with any level of greenwashing, no matter if it was by accident or, let's say, tactically. But I think on the other side, we're going to see that trend happen. It's not going to be overnight, but as we see with the European Union, they're obviously in a consultation right now. And with that consultation, at the end of, I think, Q3, we're probably going to see finally a policy in place that will then tackle that for the continent of the EU. But I think that's going to be the same for a lot of countries. And if you go on the UN website, just type in UN Red Plus, and there's a public website. You can see literally color-coded map of the world, which jurisdictions already have something of this in place. And I think it was actually Deutsche Bank that was one of the biggest partners to start the trading in the sovereign markets, and by seeing the benefit, but also the value generation that it had for those institutions themselves. And I think that's the other part to look at, not just the divestment of which sovereign markets you want to play in, but also looking at that circular flow of funding. And I think that's the other thing that's interesting, because of course, once you start, as we know with the law of economics, then of course it's only going to have the multiplier factor. So I think that's what super excites me. I think to come back to the part on voluntary, I think voluntary would disappear, mind you. I think there will always be some element, because obviously those who've traded, there's a retirement date for obviously those credits, so whatever that lifetime is. So don't discard them. They're not going to disappear overnight. So any corporation is probably going to start blogging against me, saying Adam said something. No, I acknowledge that if you're investing, absolutely it's going that way. But I can tell you that the level of rigor is only going to increase, and I think that's for the benefit of everybody, to be honest, including the banks. And I think the final point, sorry, I did say that the last one was, but I think it's also going to be the linkage between individuals, so really the consumer lens, as well as the corporate. Everything's been corporate driven so far, but similar to the consumer banking, I think that's also going to start picking up, not just about green deposits, whether it's aligned to the UN PRIs and all that good stuff, but actually looking at those who even more consciously, not just having renewable energy for their own utilities, but looking at all their transactions over a course of a year and then wanting to purchase credits. That trend's also picking up since the last 2 years. And I think that is a huge market which is underestimated right now.
You're absolutely correct. As you said, this is all heating up. ESG is heating up. The industry is heating up. The globe is heating up. This discussion is heating up, and we're running out of time, as is always the case. And like I said at the beginning, this is probably something we could dive into and passionately talk about for at least 3 hours, and maybe share a couple of environmentally friendly beers and dive into this in a lot more details. But we are running towards the end rapidly of this episode. I'm just wondering, just very quickly, Adam, is there anything that you feel passionately about that we have not asked, not spoken about, that you want to cover before we round off?
Yeah, I think probably just two things, to be honest. So one, in my introduction, I said I'm an EU Climate Pact ambassador, and it's a nice grandiose title. Proud to be aligned to DG Climate in the EU Commission on this. But I think the reason I mention that is that for those who are just out of pure curiosity or just want to upskill, there's obviously a load of different knowledge hubs out there with like TCFD, TNFD, etc. But please do check out the DG Climate, because they're, even for any sector, let's take farmers. So it drives me bonkers when I drive my EV car, hasten to add, along the road, and I see all these ploughed fields, and it just means all the carbon being re-released. If you actually go on those knowledge bases, it actually informs you the policies, the carbon pricing, internal pricing, and actually doing the simulation. There's a tool called En-ROADS. Please do check it out. It's for free. It doesn't cost you anything, but I think that will also give you more of a variety depending obviously on what your portfolio is. I think the final one is just the role of the banks and fintech in general. And I know I've been very passionate about ESG, I always will be, but I think it's also realizing about that forward integration of being, whether it's the decarbonization advisor, biodiversity, whatever the case might be. We spoke a lot about AI and about how banks need new capabilities for analytics, but I think the role, especially when we start talking about small, medium enterprises, and this is slightly ironic because in the EU, at least, there's a new legislation known as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which means around 50,000 firms in the EU have to start reporting this about ESG impacts that they're having. Financial institutions for 7 markets are now not needing to do this, unfortunately, but it's at the discretion for the remaining 20 to decide. But the reason I mention that is that we shouldn't leave anybody behind. So although we talk at the corporate level and we might talk, let's say, at the tech startup level, I think those small, medium enterprises who've got zero clue even about what the acronym ESG means, I think that's a new role that fintech and banks need to really embrace more wholeheartedly than taking this as purely a disclosure and a lending decision-making process. And I think there's huge value to be added, whether you're doing the reporting as a service, having avatars as your decarb advisor in an online manner, rather than having to upskill all the branches just so you start getting scale. There's so many opportunities out there, but the personalization of that is huge. Yeah. And I think that stickiness is also another element which is yet to really be let's say we're just scratching the surface, which is yet to really be embraced wholeheartedly, at least at the mainstream banking today.
Fantastic. We've had some very serious discussions here, very important discussions, but as every one of our listeners know, we like to infuse a little bit of comedy and lightheartedness into our episodes. And with that, we invite our guests to share a joyful, funny story or joke. And I'm wondering whether you've come with your toolkit and brain full of something joyful to share with us today, Adam.
Yeah, I'm. If anyone's seeing the podcast with the video, I'm looking for my dog. We literally got a dog at the weekend, and the reason for sharing this, one of the first ever sessions I had when I was in the Square Mile in London, training session I had, was formerly known about the pooper and the scooper story.
Okay.
And I think this is quite relevant for ESG in terms of the whole greenwashing notion. So basically, cut a long story short, it's a football game or a soccer game for our friends across the other side of the Atlantic. And clearly before the kids started playing, there's been a dog that's clearly done its business. Now, instead of anybody actually taking care of this, there's basically a number of individuals on the touchline, so mothers, fathers shouting out to the kids, score a goal, but mind the pile over there. And basically, the notion is that one guy in the end, it's a true story, so I will share a link in the YouTube so you can buy the book. One guy, he was the scooper. He solved the problem. He got rid of what was, let's say, alluding to causing not the perfect match for those involved. And where this analogy or metaphor is going is that, like with ESG, there's going to be a lot of bumps or, let's say, unexpected presence on the roads. Don't be the pooper, be the scooper.
Love that.
Today's podcast.
Oh my God, I'm going to take that with me for so many different scenarios. Don't be the pooper, be the scooper. I love that. Yeah, I think we could apply that to an awful lot of things in our life. But thank you Thank you very, very much for joining us today, Adam. It's been a fantastically interesting discussion. I've actually definitely learned an awful lot. It's opened my eyes. I think there's a call to action here for all the banks. Get serious about ESG, do the right things, or face your doom. I think that's what we're basically saying here over the next couple of years. Those are my words. Don't apply them to Adam, because I don't want him to suddenly get beaten up by a whole load of banks out there. But it's been fantastic. Thank you for joining us. If anyone wants to know a little bit more about ESG and get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, by all means. So I'm predominantly on LinkedIn. So we'll stick a little link in the chats. Absolutely, reach out to me, message me via LinkedIn. More than happy to come back and address any points, both in a voluntary or indeed on any of the topics we discussed today in terms of the regulatory stuff. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Adam. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you as always for joining us. Thank you for sticking with this episode. Hope you found it as interesting and exciting as Ville and I did. If you did, leave a comment underneath. Tell us what you thought was the most interesting. Tell us what you and your organization are doing in the area of ESG. Maybe even you yourself. How do you feel about the climate, about the environment, the continuously dying planet that we're living on, and what are we going to do about it? Because I, for one, do not want to live on Mars. I know some of you potentially maybe do. I don't, and I think me and my kids would much rather be here on planet Earth, where we have this fantastic, joyful planet for us to enjoy with all of its magnificence. Let's not kill it, let's keep it alive and do what we can for it. But more importantly, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave us a comment, and tell your friends about the fantastic podcast that is Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.